Welcome to the LNSAC National Symposium Advancing Integrity in College Sport. We come to you from the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. The topic? Are we getting what we paid for? Entertainment or education?
She's an award-winning national sports columnist for USA Today, one of my favorites, a commentator for CNN, ABC News, PBS NewsHour, and National Public Radio, a best-selling author and a nationally known speaker. Please welcome Christine Brennan.
Thank you. Julie, thanks. Thank you. Well, thanks, Julie. Thank you to everyone. Donna, great to see you. What a program, what an event. And I'm so honored to be here again. Thanks to all of you for being here. And what I want this panel to be is a conversation and really try to dive into some of these important issues that you've been talking about all day. The wonderful leadership of Bill Roden and Mark Hyman, dear friends of mine, and I'm, as I said, so honored to follow them. Quick introductions, and then let's just get right into it. We have, to my immediate left, the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board, Jennifer Abruzzo. Tom, I'm not going to say the honorable. I'm just not going to do it. My dear friend, former congressman, Olympic silver medalist. We'll talk all about that. 1972 Olympics, the worst, one of the worst things ever to happen in Olympic Games in terms of stealing a gold medal away from a wonderful team, the U.S. men's basketball team. A leader in this space for decades, the great and honorable Tom McMillan. Another dear friend, also an incredible voice. I've quoted him many times in columns, Professor Emeritus of Economics at Smith College, our dear friend, Andy Zimbalist. And last but far from least, the president of Howard University, a professor of surgery at the Howard University College of Medicine. We are so honored to have you, Dr. Wayne Frederick. I thought I'd start with a really scintillating question. The topic of our panel is, are we getting what we paid for, entertainment or education? And I thought the first thing that we could do here is just take that question, that very broad question of where we are on economics versus education, the thought of student athletes. We know so many of the issues, many of you out here are far more expert than I on these issues. But the general thought here, entertainment or education, what is it? Where is it headed? I don't know, Jennifer, if you want to get started on that first, we'll just go down this way and your kind of opening thoughts on our topic. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks so much for having me. I hope everyone can hear me.
Working?
I don't know. Is it working? Are we okay? Okay, good, great. So I come at this from a completely different perspective, I think, than many of the other panelists, in that what I'm looking at as a Fed is whether or not people who are providing services for an institution and whose daily lives are significantly controlled by that institution are being properly classified as employees versus something else, and sometimes being misclassified. And so certainly the student athletes moniker is problematic from my perspective when you look at what players at academic institutions, particularly private sector institutions, which is what I have jurisdiction over, whether or not they are getting the benefit of the statutory protections under the National Labor Relations Act, which is the right to engage in union activity, the right to engage in other protected concerted activity for mutual aid or protection, such as collective action around health and safety issues, protections in that manner, or regarding racial inequities or lack of opportunity. So I'm looking at it from the lens of whether or not players are workers and are entitled to be treated as such, get the statutory protections that they are so deserving of, particularly as they contribute so greatly to the teams, the conferences. And so I would say I'm actually looking at it as if they're going to be educated and should be educated, and they're students, that's one thing. But if their daily lives are going to be significantly controlled by institutions and conferences and the NCAA, then they're workers and they should be afforded all the protections that they deserve.
Thank you, Jennifer. Tom?
Well, I really think it's both, entertainment and education. You know, you look back to when Notre Dame started playing football in 1887 or Michigan in 1879, or, you know, these schools have been doing this for years. Yes, to give their students and their athletes a chance to compete, but also because it was just great marketing for those institutions. And so that's been going on for years. The issue's always been the ebb and flow between academics and commercialism. It's just age old, and it still exists today. And, you know, we have to continue to push to maintain the education model, because commercialism is so prevailing, so dominant in so many areas, whether you look at the creeping sports betting or coaches' salaries and severance package. Commercialism is rapidly growing, and it's really hard to keep this academic model going. And if you don't have that, then college sports really just looks like a form of the NFL and the NBA. And I think that's a mistake. I believe very strongly in the scholar athlete model. It made a big difference in my life, and it makes a big difference in a lot of kids' life. And maintaining that will be the challenge. And, you know, that's how I look at it. And it's never easy, because the forces of commercialism are very, very difficult to control. And just one quick example. When I was in Congress, we tried to get graduation rates disclosed. Imagine that, how innocuous that seems. And Bill Bradley and myself and other congressmen, we put up a bill to try to get graduation rates disclosed. I mean, can you imagine a kid not knowing the graduation rates of a school? And what happened was the NCAA fought us, everybody fought us. We ended up passing it. Why? Because Dexter Manley testified a year before our bill that he could not read or write. He went all the way through college. And so that crisis pushed that bill through. But I'm saying to myself, that's academics, and we're constantly fighting to keep the balance, and that fight will continue.
Thanks, Tom. Andy?
So I think we are getting entertainment. We're getting more and more of it, actually. 9.9 million people watched the women's final game in the March Madness tournament. That's a lot of people. It sets all sorts of records. And not only that, unlike the men's final game, which was played at prime time, this was played at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the women's game. And it wasn't even a very close game. So we're getting a lot of entertainment, and college sports is not failing us, at least not yet in that area. It's moving in the right direction. Education, not so much. For Division I, men's basketball, women's basketball, football, between 50 and 60% of the athletes over 6 years are graduating. That's unacceptably low. With regard to the issues that Jennifer and Tom just raised, I think if you look at the economic and material characteristics of college athletes, certainly in Division I and in most sports, they do bear all of the hallmarks of employees, but they have an additional characteristic, which is that they're students, and they're part of a model which is supposed to prioritize education. And I think we can't define the economic circumstances of college athletes only looking at the economic characteristics of their relationship to the school. We have to consider what's the primary purpose of their being at the school, which is education. I think it's very important, however, for us to address the exploitation of college athletes, particularly at the top levels, and particularly in sports where the great majority of the players are minorities. The idea of giving college athletes 50% of the revenue, which many people are promoting these days, because that's roughly the share that athletes get in football, basketball, and hockey in the United States, and baseball, give the college athletes 50%. I think that's a fine idea, but they shouldn't be getting 50% in salaries, and they shouldn't be turned into employees. They should be getting 50% in terms of medical care and enhanced educational benefits. That's the right way to go if we want to retain college sports as it's existed in the United States and been so successful in providing entertainment for us in the United States for so many years. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And Dr. Frederick.
Sure. So I'm certainly in the camp that we're getting both. I think we're getting too much of one and too little of the other. We're certainly getting great entertainment. There's no doubt about it. Great enough entertainment that I flew to North Carolina and then drove to Wake Forest to watch my son play at Duke on Sunday, and then flew back here for a meeting. That's how much entertainment we're getting from college athletics. He's a Division I soccer player at Duke, and he's a starter as a freshman. I don't consider him an employee, but we'll get into that a little later. What I would say is, in terms of this issue, I think there are a couple of things. We have a couple of sports that are skewing the landscape. There are lots of kids who are playing tennis, soccer, swimming, and unfortunately, when we get into this conversation, I think we unfortunately look at a couple of sports that certainly have a very skewed revenue base, coaches that are making significant amounts of money, and I think that obviously tends to skew the conversation. You guys, I think, met my swim coach. He certainly isn't making what Nick Saban is making, but he's doing a fantastic job at Howard. We're the only swim team at an HBCU. African Americans are 5 times more likely to drown. Those kids are out in the community teaching Black kids in our community to swim, etc. They're bringing a lot of value to the community as well as student athletes. 80% of my athletes at Howard graduate. So again, when you look at African American athletes, you look at where they're heading, the types of opportunities that they're getting. Again, for the majority of athletes in certain sports at the majority of our schools, I think there's a lot for them to get from that. And so the entertainment value is certainly high, but I would encourage many of you who looked at that NCAA tournament for men's and women's basketball to also spend some time going and looking at tennis and swimming and diving and other sports that I think get overlooked in this discussion, and also talk to those athletes and talk about where they end up. 50% of the athletes on my tennis team end up in professional schools, as an example. So I think that there's a lot more to be said about what should be happening with the education. I don't doubt that, but I think we have a skewed conversation taking place about the entertainment, unfortunately.
Of course, sure. Go ahead, Tom.
I think Dr. Frederick hit it right on the nose. There's 520,000 athletes in the NCAA. About 20,000 of them, 4%, are really in revenue producing sports, give or take. So you're talking about 4%, but all the other athletes are the ones that Dr. Frederick was talking about. They go to school, they're getting educations. Yes, we have a problem in those other two sports and maybe a few others, but that's where so you can't look at this exactly as one issue, because it's really almost two models. And Charlie Baker talks about this. He says there's really two models, and we have to keep that in mind when we talk about this.
Well, and we've had these conversations, and certainly last year we were here and talking about this. The difference, it seems to me, a change for all of us is those 3 letters, NIL. Right, that has been the big change over the last couple of years. I mean, this has been a conversation that's been going on for quite a while. Tom, Andy, all of us have had it. So I want to ask you about the role of NIL and kind of throw it out to anyone. We don't have to necessarily go down the row each time, and anyone can chime in who would like to. About NIL, right now, basically boosters are just making these decisions. And we know the University of Miami football story, throwing millions at a kid. Oh, I'm not coming there. We also know how great it can be. I mean, Caitlin Clark is probably going to stay at Iowa. Was going to stay in Iowa 1 year for sure. I mean, she's got her senior year to come, but she may well decide to take her COVID year because she'll probably make more money with NIL than she will in the WNBA. That's amazing. I would have never thought I could have said that sentence 2 years ago. And the same for Angel Reese and the LSU players as well. Depending on what grade they're in and et cetera. So it's not just football and men's basketball, which we kind of thought it might be. And it's gymnastics. It's Olivia Dunn. It's all these Instagram accounts and these women, remarkably,
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and start. I think NIL poses an interesting conundrum. I do think that athletes should have the opportunity. However, I do think that during their playing time, they should not get that cash during their playing time. I would have loved to see the NCAA step up to the plate and act sooner. We've been in a reactive position in terms of the NCAA, and I think that has hurt us. But having said that, I think giving athletes an annuity that they could get around the ages of 35 to 40, when most athletes, I think, have run out the opportunity of running around trying to get into a professional circumstance, probably would have been a better way to manage this. Having said that, it is what it is as it's set up now. We have to separate the athletes signing NIL contracts from the schools. I think there's a perverted interest there that we have to make sure we manage and regulate. I think that lack of regulation is concerning. And as you said, I think boosters can now be in cohorts with colleges and universities for recruitment purposes. And I think that again is gonna hurt what we need to do. I think the second thing that needs to be done is we need to have some clearinghouse system to look at these contracts to make sure that these young men and women are not being overly exploited very early on with NIL deals. Some of them signed lifetime deals. And you have to remember, for a kid, giving a kid $50,000 at the age of 17, 18, they see tomorrow, and that's still $50,000. So looking at the details of what they sign and who's licensed to sign them, I think is the other thing that we need to look at as well. And then the last thing I'd say on the NIL front as well, since you mentioned, some of the athletes and how their potential for what they can make. I think the last thing that we do need to look at is to make sure that we have some accountability, an ongoing accounting of what's taking place, so that there's some transparency as to what athletes are signing with whom, and so that we don't see certain patterns of behavior tied to boosters that are covering up their activity by using companies, et cetera, as we already are seeing at a few universities at present. And so, those are my thoughts about that issue.
I'll chime in. So I think some guardrails are needed, but I also think that NIL contracts that are signed legitimately with third parties should not be regulated or restricted by NCAA rules. Athletes should have the same rights that other students have. If some third party wants to support their social media activities or wants to use their name, image, and likeness in some other way, then they should be able to sign those contracts, and they shouldn't have to wait until they're 35 or 40 to reap those benefits. They should get them right away. We want Bruce Smith to be able to have a haircut and buy pizza on the same day. But I do think that there's another question with NILs that's not being talked about very much, and that's the financial aspect for U.S. Athletic departments. The economic model as it's currently being practiced in American universities is broken. Last year, for which we have data before the pandemic, the data has just gotten worse and worse since the pandemic, but the last year we have data before the pandemic was 2019, and the median FBS program athletic program lost $18.8 million in terms of what's actually reported in the books. The real numbers are worse than that because they don't include a lot of capital expenses and various other indirect expenses. $18.8 million median loss. One of the things that's happening with NILs, and again, I support them, and so this, I think it's fine that this is happening on an ethical level and a political level, but on a financial level, one of the things that's happening is that individuals like boosters and companies who would buy sponsorships with athletic departments in the past And alums who would make donations in the past to the central fund, to the educational fund, that money is now going to students, or a lot of that money is going to student athletes through NIL deals. And again, I think that that's appropriate, but one of the implications of it is that these athletic departments that have been losing millions and millions of dollars are going to start losing more because money is not going to flow to them the way they did in the past. And one of the things that's happening as a result of that is that athletic departments in desperation are searching for other funds. And one of the places, alas, where they've alighted, where they found some other funds or think they're going to find some other funds is in sports betting. And so we have a number of universities now in the United States that have signed deals with sports books, which are sponsorship deals. They might get money up front, and some of them get money according to the number of students at the university who sign up for betting accounts with FanDuel or DraftKings or MGM or whatever. And I think that, you know, this is a problem at many multiple and important levels. Not only do we have the historic problem of game fixing, and we know that in colleges, there's much more vulnerability here than there is for the NBA. Rich Lapchip was talking earlier about the NBA and excuse me, my phone is ringing. I'll be back with you in 5 minutes. Sorry about that. I think that one of the things that happens at college is that most of the student athletes are not being paid, or they're making a little bit of money on NIL, and they can very well and rightfully feel like they're being taken advantage of, and they're much more vulnerable to gamblers and fixing games. So that's one problem. Another problem is that athletes who don't perform well in games that are being bet on sometimes get assaulted for not doing better in those games. But I think the largest problem is the following. We have 16 million undergraduates, actually 16.3, I think, million undergraduates in the United States. Various estimates say that somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% of them bet on sports at one time or other during the year. That takes us to 10 million people who bet on sports, university students. And according to various estimates, somewhere between 2 and 7% of that population becomes a problem gambler or an addictive gambler. And that means that they're losing money, that they don't have money to pay the bets. They've made bets with people who want their money back. And these people are in the dormitories, and there are roughly 500,000 of them, according to the numbers and the estimates that are being made. And they're living with the other students, and it has to corrupt the life of the students in the dormitories. So I think we have a problem here on many, many levels, and it has its root in part in the financial crisis that college sports is experiencing. Another problem that emerges out of the financial crisis is the conference jumping, which supposedly enhances some conferences, even though, as has been alluded to earlier today, it means some students have to take plane flights back and forth from Los Angeles to New Brunswick, New Jersey, New Jersey. But when some of the schools go to conferences where they think the grasses are greener on the other side, it means that the existing schools in those conferences now are left bereft of their economic generators. So it creates a lot of chaos. In other words, there's a whole concatenation of relationships here. Another relationship is that colleges are picking up the burden of training professional athletes, right? The NFL gets free training for its athletes. It gets 4 years of maturation and physical development of its athletes. It gets 4 years of building up the notoriety and the name, image, and likeness of people who might end up in the NFL. And they don't have any minor leagues. And they're not paying the colleges a penny to do what the colleges do for the NFL. The average Major League Baseball team spends $30 million a year on its player development system where they have minor leagues. So here too, and this is all connected to the financial crisis. It involves a lot of elements of our society, and they must be, I think they have to be addressed in a coherent and cohesive way.
Oh, boy. We kind of went astray from NIL there, but those are all very important
No,
points.
but I think what Andy's showing us, and I know we all agree, everything is interconnected.
It is.
So
And
Tom
so,
and then certainly Jennifer. Go ahead.
I'll just add a couple points on the sports betting issue, and then I'll get back to NIL. The NCAA 2003 was the last time they surveyed student athletes on this subject. And they found at the time that 60% of the males and 42% of the women had engaged in some form of sports betting. It could have been pools, whatever. And that was way before sports betting was legalized. So I do believe the NCAA is going to refresh that study. And to Andy's point, it's a very serious issue. But back to NIL. NIL is a really good thing. It's a good thing. And I'm so happy because it's helped so many women really actualize and really monetize their publicity rights. And so terrific. It's also been a great tool to help retain kids in college, as Christine was saying. You know, back in 1992, I wrote a book called Out of Bounds, and this is what I said in it. And I said, and Annie made this point, is that the pros need to create other pathways for athletes that don't want to go to college. All these issues somewhat revolve around not every kid should be in college. Your academics all are related to that. So one of the things that I firmly believe in is that NIL is showing us a pathway to keep kids in school longer and to retain them through the market. And we ought to be doing that because the goal should be to get every kid a degree. Now, to Dr. Frederick's point, we need some national standards here. We can't have this patchwork of state standards. It makes sense to have a national standard, and that's generally the times when Congress steps in. And my last point is that, you know, the NFL and the NBA would never allow third-party organizations to be so involved with their number one asset, their athletes. And so I think that the whole collective thing was a mistake. I think the schools should have been empowered right up front to run these things, to create a player division, to have your compliance departments, to make sure it's being done right. Because here's what I hear from the ADs. They say half the collectives, they wouldn't even hire those people that are running those collectives for their own athletic department. So it's gotten out of control. And I think there are ways to bring it back into control. Bottom line, it's a really positive thing.
So the NLRB, obviously, you guys are keeping an eye on all this, I'm assuming. What kind of thoughts do you have about NIL?
Well, what I was gonna, I mean, NIL, I mean, to me, it makes them more akin to professional players and therefore, you know, more akin to falling under our statutory protections. But just listening to all of this and all of the exploitation that we know happens, particularly with, you know, unsophisticated young workers, although, you know, that happens in in athletics as well as elsewhere. But to me, one answer or one entity that I haven't heard discussed at all that perhaps could help in advocating and be a buffer to players are labor organizations. And I don't know where they are at the table, if at all, but I think that by enabling players to freely choose advocates and representatives to help them actualize or realize, you know, deal with certain mutual issues of concern, that's going to help everybody. And I will say, I mean, obviously under my statute, we only have jurisdiction over private sector institutions, the NCAA conferences, any conference, for example, where there are private schools, member schools, they would fall under our jurisdiction as well, even though not all of them are private schools. But there's also voluntary recognition. I was joking, but kind of not joking. Like, I think we need, before we started today, and one answer is comprehensive collective bargaining. Like, let's get all the major issues on the table and let's figure out how to better help these kids, get the education that they richly deserve, but also get the money that they richly deserve as well.
So Jennifer, if we give you a crystal ball, is that happening over the next 5 to 10 years? There's so much change and it's been so quick, right? There's in many ways, many of the minds here knew this was coming and the minds up here did, but now it's really happening, right? And does unionization, does that literally hit all of our college campuses in the next few years? Could you kind of give your thoughts on what this might look like? And in your professional opinion, where that piece of this might be headed?
So as I said, I mean, right now, so there is the College Right to Organize Act that's out there, a piece of legislation that's just hanging out there. And that would certainly then include not only private institutions, but also public institutions. So right now, the right to organize is only for those that go to private institutions, number one. But as I said, any public institution could voluntarily recognize a labor organization that players may want to represent them and advocate on their behalf. So certainly there could be a model across the board because obviously the schools are different, players are different, but some of the issues are exactly the same. So you could have in my mind, you could have a national collective bargaining agreement over those issues of mutual concern. And then there'll be these outlier kind of local supplemental agreements with regard to particular institutions. That may be, I'm optimistic by nature. So I can't say in 5 years what's going to happen. I will tell you, we did have a case come up with Northwestern University where the players wanted to organize that particular institution, football players, and the board did not take, it was a different board, did not take jurisdiction over it at the time. At the time, we did issue, I along with the general counsel at the time, issued a memo saying, yeah, but they still are statutory employees. They still need to be afforded the protections that we offered, not only us, but OSHA, EEOC, wage and hour, workers' comp, many other statutes out there, and many other agencies that would protect these players who I consider to be, at least in Northwestern, we had all the facts in that particular case, and it was a private institution. And so we certainly felt that based upon the significant amount of control that institution and the NCAA had over them, that in fact, they deserved our protections, and we would protect their rights to engage, to organize or engage in other advocacy to improve health and safety or whatever issues that they had. So I think that, and we have new cases that are coming forward. We have one with USC right now in Pac-12 and NCAA. We're also seeing cases where players are feeling like they're misclassified. In other words, that they really are workers or employees that are deserving of our protections, but that they're being chilled from exercising their rights because they're being told, you're not employees, you'll never be employees. There's got to be some other model out there. And so we'll see, but as optimistic as I am, I'm not sure we'll have all of, and as was said, it's not only football and it's not only basketball, and we may get into like Title IX implications later, but and frankly, I will just say this, as I mentioned at the beginning, a worker is someone who performs services for an institution, and that institution has control over, or the right to control, significant aspects of their daily lives. In Northwestern, we found that to be the daily schedules, the competition hours, the where to live, what to eat, et cetera, eligibility standards from the NCAA, compliance requirements, et cetera. So we certainly, have seen, are seeing more and more of it. And I don't know, I'm interested in, and let me just say this one thing.
Sure, oh, please.
Profit making, I understand it's a huge thing. Obviously, it's a business, but that is not dispositive of whether someone is an employee or not. And, and nor is them receiving compensation. So the fact that they're getting scholarships, yes, that may help, but it is not dispositive. So for example, people on the tennis team that may be controlled, their daily lives may be significantly controlled such that they cannot take the classes that they want to take, or can't graduate until 6 years, 8 years later, or what have you. It may be that those, they too are considered workers. It all comes down to the amount of control that they have. And I will finally say, and I'm sorry, I'm taking up a lot of time, just to say that, we also have seen, this not moniker student athletes, I mean, which was pretty much cast aside by the Supreme Court in the NCAA versus Alston case, where, they said this is not amateurism, this is a profit-making enterprise. I mean, we do need to remember that these folks, if they're workers, then they need to be afforded the panoply of the protections that they deserve. And we have seen some institutions in this moniker trying to avoid obligations under various worker protection statutes because it's costly. So let's just keep that in mind.
I want to hear from the other panelists. I do want to say full disclosure. I am a Northwestern grad. I am on the board of trustees at Northwestern. But it's a 70-person board. I found out about Kane Coulter and the unionization from the newspaper. So I mentor students and I speak to students and I deal with a lot of journalism issues on the board at Northwestern. So I had nothing to do with this, never had, never will. And I mean that. I mean, as a journalist, it's very important for me to say that. I recused myself in every interview that I was asked, never wrote a column about it. But I had literally nothing to do with it and found out, as I said, from the newspaper what was happening. So I just want to make sure, I think those of you who know me know I am as straight a shooter as hopefully you will find. I wanted to make that point. And then please go ahead, continuing the conversation.
I'm sorry, just one point that you made. I mean, look at Kane Coulter now. It's a shame what has happened to him. I don't know, what folks may or may not know, but that is
actually, I'm not sure what has happened. I know he was
so,
in the NFL or tried to make it in the NFL.
Well, so he was the spark plug.
FYI,
right?
yes, he was.
So
he was the
spark plug at Northwestern in terms of trying to. He was the one that filed a petition to try to organize that particular unit of college football players, and ultimately didn't make it into the pros for whatever reasons, but certainly part of it, and you can look at Kaepernick as well, with little blackballing going on there. And again, we go to academics versus commercialism. I'm not sure how he ultimately came out academically at the time, but I think he did struggle. And I know now he is struggling. He is close to 30 years old and he is having significant issues. And I think some of it has to do with concussion aspects that he has suffered, but he's having significant issues with his family, with holding down a job, with a variety of other things. So it's just a sad tale, but I'm not sure that that's the only one out there, as was said, the college athlete, particularly football, they are grooming folks for the pros. And then what happens when they don't make the pros? And if they don't have the education, back them up to go into some other field.
I think Kane did graduate. I feel that he.
No, I'm not suggesting he didn't, but I can tell you that right now it's not doing so well.
And that's troublesome.
In fact, fewer than 2% of all men's basketball and football players in college ever play a single game in the NFL or the NBA. And that's why it's so important for the system to generate real education for these people. The 1.6% who end up going to the NFL, playing one game at least in the NFL, and the 1.4% who play one game in the NBA. We could redesign the college system to make sure they're not financially exploited. But those are people who are about to go into the NBA, where the average salary is now almost $8 million a year, and the NFL, where the average salary is over $3 million a year. I don't think we should redesign the entire system to deal with those people. Before we leave NIL, and I'm fearful maybe we have already, but I'm going to take us back to it for just a second, because there's another very important element to it that I think is important to share, which is that the collectives that Tom alluded to overwhelmingly are being formed to support men's basketball and football. Yes, they're individual female athletes, and it's terrific, who are making nice NIL money, but the 80% of money that's being generated by the collectives or more is going to support recruitment and retention of football players and men's basketball players. And this system has evolved out of the transfer portal and out of the NIL system without any regulation at all. OCR has been too busy and too understaffed to really grapple with it yet. But it's something that we have to look at very carefully, because if we care about gender equity, we care about Title IX, then we have to do something about the way collectives are being operated. I want to come back later because I'm talking too much, but I want to come back and engage with Jennifer about unionization and collective bargaining.
Well, I would say probably now, Andy, is about the best time, because I don't know that later is gonna, I mean, if you want, go ahead. I mean,
Can we have all the doors back there locked? We're going to go till 7 o'clock. I know it says 4:30 or something. Yeah, so look, I think that there's a real tendency by lawyers and by others to look very strictly at the National Labor Relations Act, look at other labor legislation, look at the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act and other antitrust legislation, and treat college sports as if all they are is a commercial activity. And I think if you do that, then yeah, sure, there should be unionization and they should be called employees, and antitrust law should be applied vigorously against some of the things that the NCAA has been up to. But it's not just a commercial activity. It's an educational activity first and foremost. And if we want to preserve that function and we want to preserve the role of college sports in our society, we can't just look at it in terms of commercial antitrust law and commercial labor law.
but Andy, is it anymore? I mean, listen, we all have idealized views of the punter who's in the chemistry class that we took. Well, I didn't, but that we took, you know, and now there they are on the field, right? And when you come back for homecoming, and that's just the greatest feeling. But I think what we're seeing from the Supreme Court, Jennifer, you're the expert, not me, is that maybe the commercial part is the thing. I mean, you know how I feel about student athletes, and I, of course, want them to graduate and have wonderful careers. But are we in a different place now?
I'm not guided intellectually by the Supreme Court and Justice Kavanaugh. Look,
no,
you know,
of
might be
course.
the cat, maybe the cat's
was a
out of the
good
bag
answer.
and we can't rescue it, but I think it's worth an effort. And I think this is a time, as Senators Booker and Blumenthal said to us moments ago, this is a time when Congress is getting involved. And after years and years of thinking, of having their gestalt was, no, we shouldn't touch the private sector. We should never interfere with the private sector. Now they're starting to realize that college sports is in chaos and they have to do something. So this is a good time, I think, to make our last effort to save what I think has been, in terms of our U.S. culture, a very rewarding and rich experience that we've had.
Before we go to Tom or Dr. Jennifer, do you have any follow-up at all?
I would just say, you know, collective bargaining is not a bad thing, right? It's actually a good thing. I mean, the pros in football, the pros in basketball, the pros in baseball are all organized. So, I mean, it's not, and I understand, I completely get it, you know, that maybe Kavanaugh got it wrong. I mean, by the way, Kavanaugh said one way to deal, in that Austin case, one way to deal with what's going on with regard to compensation is to engage in collective bargaining. And I'm not a huge Kavanaugh fan, but so it's just not, it's not a bad word. It shouldn't be considered a bad word, I guess, collective bargaining, you know, or maybe you just say advocating on behalf of players. And there are certain entities that can do that better than others. But the thing is look, I'm not here to make the players workers, but it seems to me we're at the point, to Christine's point, where the players' daily lives, at least in football, and we've seen it in basketball versus both male and female sports, they are significantly controlled. Their entire daily lives are significantly controlled by their institutions, such that they have no control over what classes to take, when to take them, where to go, where to live, or what have you. So if institutions want to cede that control, great, then they're students. But if institutions are unwilling to cede that control, then they have to deal with the consequences.
The question is, go ahead, Tom.
Let me just talk, I mean, we're talking here, but let's talk real politics for a second, because I mean, look, we're talking absolutism, like on one hand, this is so commercial, we got to clean it up. On the other side, the pure side is we've got to really, really push the academic side of it. Let's be real about this. The Congress today is in no position. The House of Representatives, if they voted tomorrow, would be against employment status for student athletes. The Senate would be hard pressed to pass anything near an employment model. Now, you go to the National Labor Relations Board, you know as well as I do, your agency's become a whipsaw. So you go forward and you proclaim student athletes as employees at private institutions and use joint employer. All of a sudden, Republican administration come in, and they will, because our country is going back and forth, they will unwind this completely. And we're going to be in chaos. And so I don't think the answer to this is either the courts or the administrative agencies. I think the answer to this is you got to come to Congress and come up with a new model, particularly for the revenue sports, and a model that does not harm the bulk of the other sports. Why? Because our Olympic effort depends on those sports. 75% of the kids that play in the Summer Olympics went to play in our college sports. We cannot destroy that. 80% of Americans' youth right now are unfit to serve in our military. We have a problem in this country. College sports can help solve some of those problems. And it's a two-set problem. One is we've got to preserve the good, those 500,000 kids who are going through and competing as scholar athletes. And there's this 20,000 of the kids where it's a very commercial model, and we have to get those excesses under control. The only way to do that is through our political processes. We sit down and we make compromises. And yes, we may not go to full employment status, but we can come up with a model that works. And to those who say, why should athletes have a special model? They already do. The IRS treats college athletes different than any other category. And so my only point is that we can either go this whipsaw approach where we can have California do something and Ohio do something, Maryland do something, and Alabama and Mississippi won't, and the National Labor Relations Board does it, and then it gets turned around the next presidential race. I think we need to sit down and come up with a model that works for our future, that takes into account that basketball and football and other revenue sports are very different from the other 500,000 athletes. And that's the reality of the situation.
Dr. Frederick, would you like to
Yeah.
chime in on
I
this?
was gonna say before Chief Justice Roberts shows up here, I'd love to get a word in edgewise since we are talking about academics. A couple of things. I'm on the Knight Commission board, so just for the sake of full disclosure, but the Knight Commission also has a proposal of a CARE financial model that would allow for the revenue distribution for us to look at the revenue distribution through a different lens. And I think one of the things that often is not fully exposed in this conversation is the number of Black athletes that we're talking about. And the fact that most of these institutions, for instance, that would receive in 2032, if the NCAA is able to use the current distribution model, $1 billion would be redistributed back to universities and colleges. 80% of the universities who participate will actually receive that money. Unfortunately, 47% of those universities have at least a 25% gap in the graduation rate between Black athletes and white athletes. And for some reason, we don't factor that into the conversation. We need to hold universities responsible around those things like the graduation rate. When we talk about the academics here, we talk about it in a very skewed manner. We're talking about two revenue sports that are predominantly Black athletes that are making money for institutions that have no interest in their graduation rate. Let's be clear. If you remove basketball and football from this discussion, we're having a very different conversation. We are not questioning whether or not academics is the output for the student athlete, whether or not graduation is the output. And I think that's an unfortunate part of the conversation. So that's one thing. So let's deal with basketball and football. So one is a CARE financial model in which we hold institutions and they don't get a distribution, at least not of the size that they should, if they have a graduation rate difference between Black and white athletes. So that's one. And that will help certainly with basketball significantly. And on football, you have a CFP that we know is a behemoth unto itself. So what we're doing is we're trying to balance the elephant on a pinhead, with the pinhead being the rest of college athletics and CFP being the elephant. And we just have to be very clear, either we separate the two or we rebalance the conversation. So all of this stuff about collective bargaining, et cetera, we're trying to use a very, very complicated solution for what I think is a very obvious problem by going. So what we're trying to do is fix the pinhead when the elephant is the issue. And I think we have to be honest about that. And the undertone, or at least the underpinning of that as well, is this gross neglect of the Black athlete who is supplying these universities with a largesse that the rest of the country is benefiting from. And I think that that is the unfortunate elephant in the room that does not get discussed and does not get addressed. So when we talk about concussions, we have to talk about who needs medical care. It is that same Black athlete that you talk about. So the athlete you're referring to who's struggling, he's not struggling for reasons that are unknown to us. He is struggling because he put his body on the line in a system that does not protect his care. And that is a problem. And that's what I think we need to be discussing. I'm happy to discuss collective bargaining as well at some other time, but I don't think we should be getting there without discussing, I think, some of the obvious issues that we keep trying to work around to find a solution for this minority group of people that are making a lot of money. And I think that that's gross.
Title IX. I mean, anything we do here, I think, well, we should at least have a discussion.
Oh, well, that was, you're reading my mind. As I think a few of you know, I'm kind of a big fan of Title IX. And just celebrated, of course, its 50th anniversary, June 23rd of last year. Who's counting? We all are. And on to the next 50 years. And of course, Title IX, what a gift on the playing field. And of course, what a gift off the playing field. It is just pumping out millions and millions of young women every year who are rock stars, who learn those life lessons at a very young age, not only how to win, but learning how to lose, teamwork and sportsmanship that we were teaching their brothers and their fathers and their grandfathers for generations, but not women. What in the world were we thinking? We're a better and stronger country for Title IX. And of course, these women are going to be more than 50% in the House of Representatives, more than 50 women senators, women presidents throughout the 30s and 40s. The common denominator for all of those people, leaders of universities, great leaders of business, will be that they played sports because of Title IX. The 10-year-old today, when she's 50 or 60, oh my God, what is this country going to look like? Two huge failings. The urban community, we've won the suburbs, right? Why is our U.S. women's soccer team not 50-50 black-white? It's not. That's a failure. And so we've got to reach underserved urban areas, underserved rural areas with Title IX, that next 50 years. Also women coaching women. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Women need to be coaching women in all sports. And I know Muffet McGraw and others have spoken out very eloquently on that topic. So you can tell what I think about Title IX. So if we're paying men's basketball players, and I always believe in the pesky adjective men's, as Donna knows, we need to use that word every time. If we're talking basketball, men's and women's, right? If they're playing at an elite level, and men's Final Four, women's Final Four, that's been one of my passions, as you know, for 25, 30 years in journalism, to make sure we call it respect for women by saying men's, because the women play it. It's not the real basketball and then, oh, let's pat the women on the head. Enough of that. And if we didn't learn that this year with the incredible interest in the women's game, men's and women. So if we're paying men's basketball players and we're paying football players, and maybe we're paying some women's basketball players, aren't we in complete violation of Title IX? And where are we on that as that unfolds over time?
I'll just give you my quick answer on that is, if you give $1 million to male athletes, you're going to have to give $1 million additive dollars to women athletes. I think Title IX does include employment issues. It complicates this exceedingly, but I agree with you 100%. Title IX is a growing and most important force in college sports. 153 women in Congress, that's 28%. You're right, it's going to be 50% in 20 years. And whatever you do, whatever your model, that's why I get back to the legislative process, is going to have to take it into account.
I think on the issue of that gender inequity, what we do with the distribution at the NCAA level for men and women is, again, it's just wrong. It's something that we have to correct, and we have to correct it soon. But I think beyond that, I think some of the other issues that you've raised in terms of how we look at women's athletes, I think very similar to the statistics I just gave you on Black athletes, we do have a significant gender inequity problem in terms of facilities, care, et cetera, which also has to be corrected. And again, I think a financial model that puts money, not just distributes money back to the universities, but holds them accountable for putting funds aside for these specific purposes, I think is something that we must move towards installing.
Jennifer or Andy, any thoughts?
I've already spoken enough, and I spoke
No,
about.
you have not spoken
collective-
enough. You
not-
must
well,
speak
here-
more. Please, go ahead.
Well, look, I'm completely in sync that we have to pay attention to racial exploitation and discrimination and gender discrimination. And I think that the collectives are taking us in the wrong direction. So we need some action from OCR. I'm afraid we're not going to get it very soon, but I think that's the place to look. If I could, since you're encouraging me to talk.
I don't know.
Let me add that the financial burden that I talked about earlier, another burden that college sports has on its back is the U.S. Olympic program. We're the only country in the world where the federal government doesn't subsidize financially the development of Olympic program. It gets subsidized by U.S. colleges. And in large measure, it gets subsidized by successful Division I or FBS football teams that are predominantly Black. And they're paying for the Olympic sports. So the system is under too many pressures, under too much strain. One other thought with regard to collective bargaining, I don't think it's a dirty word. I've worked for many years with unions. And in fact, I've worked with the MLBPA, the NBPA, the NFLPA, and the Hockey Players Association. And one of my observations in working with them as a consultant in collective bargaining over many years is that the younger players don't get involved and they don't participate in the discussions. The ones who get involved are the older players, the more established players. It makes me wonder, and I think at many levels there are complications and details that would have to be worked out, but it makes me wonder if we create a union structure for athletes who are 17 to 21 or 17 to 22 years old, and who are also trying to get an undergraduate degree, and they're also trying to adjust to a new social environment and so on and so forth. We've talked a lot about how busy they are and how they have no free time. How are they going to participate in the union? And they're whatever they might achieve in the union, they're going to not. It's going to take many, many years for those gains to be achieved, and they're going to be out of college at that time. So I think we have to look much more concretely at what it is specifically that we think collective bargaining will advance, and why are those things not handleable by legislation that would, admittedly from a top-down perspective, but I think also the union would be top-down. There'd be an international union coming in and telling these workers what to do. So I think that we as adults should grab the bull by its horns and solve the problems and not thrust them over to unionization, which is, as Tom points out, a very problematic road to follow politically anyway.
Christine, I was hoping to wait until the very end so that I could sneak out the door after saying this, so Andy
Okay.
doesn't get me.
Well,
But
this is
since
gonna be
Andy
good then.
went there twice now, he has mentioned university financing and how we finance sports as an issue. I want to tackle that because I do think that is a little bit of a misguided issue. We have a system in this country around our higher education system that is skewed. And a lot of it has to do with how we have viewed higher education over the course of the past 6 decades. One of the universities in this country that has the largest number of Division I sports is actually Harvard University. Their endowment is $50 billion. They are not on TV every weekend. You're not seeing them with taking the biggest college athletes, et cetera. They just received a $300 million gift from an alum. Like they needed that, I needed a hole in my head. No, so let's be realistic. They have a 5% spending rule. They could take 5% of their endowment, which would be $2.5 billion, and they could run 2 Howard universities. Let's just be clear. Howard University sends more African Americans to medical school than any institution in this country. We've graduated more Black physicians than any institution in this country over its history. We send more African Americans to STEM PhD programs over the past 2.5 decades than Stanford, MIT, Harvard, and Yale combined. So if we really want to bring the issue of college athletics, we cannot separate the financing from the broader financing of what we do at universities with Pell Grants, with how we serve underserved students across the board in the country. So I think it's a little bit of a misdirection when we talk about the broken financial system around athletics. I agree with Andy, but there's a larger broken system of education in the country in terms of how we're financing higher ed, period, just to put that out there.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Frederick. Jennifer, I want to go back to Title IX for a moment. Is there any way on earth in this nation of ours that you can pay men but not pay women?
You mean the same?
Right. Or even you can pay men, let's pick a football player, $100,000. If we're getting to the point of paying athletes, I mean, NIL is paying athletes, but let's say we really go there and it's that's obviously the next logical conversation, right? Could a university get away with paying a football player $100,000 a year because of the money that's coming in, obviously, for football? I love college. I think everyone in this room probably loves college football at some level, right? And you could pay a men's basketball player $100,000. I'm just making this up because they also are revenue producing. And obviously women's basketball is revenue producing some places, but let's, for the sake of argument, say that it is, it's not in this particular case. And that woman gets, and all the women's basketball players get zero.
Right. So, I mean, again, it's dependent upon whether or not in that scenario, whether or not they are considered workers, right? So if they are, then they should be compensated as such, but the compensation could be different. I would say that I would think not only under Title IX, but under Title VII, you'd run into problems with inequities if in fact they are doing the same sort of job, but just not producing the same sort of revenues. But what I just want to get back to something, and I understand maybe collective bargaining is not the greatest word to use here today, but it's also about collective action. And we are seeing, and I'll tie this together, we are seeing, at least at my agency, and perhaps it's because of the pandemic or otherwise, but we are seeing workers elevate their voices more and demanding a seat at the table and feeling empowered to ask for improvements in their working/playing conditions. And it's young workers. And it's people that, the Amazon Labor Union, for example, these are homegrown unions. So I disagree. I understand what the model has been, but that doesn't mean that that's what the model has to be in terms of who's at the table and who's in the room in advancing interests of players. And it doesn't have to be, by the way, compensation and the way we look at compensation. It could be every player gets X amount of, is part of a fund for concussions, or is part of a fund for higher education, or, where they're receiving something. So, that's why I say, again, it isn't one size fits all, but I still believe that there is room for more voices at the table than are currently there. And frankly, I'm not sure this is a legislative fix. I think this can be done more on a homegrown, because I don't think it will ever happen legislatively, frankly. It'll take years and years, maybe I'm wrong. But I do think that it's broken, and I think there are ways internally to fix it, but I think you've got to introduce more voices to the table and more people that are going to advocate on behalf of players.
And I couldn't agree more, coming from as a Democrat and very pro-labor, I understand all that. I think the difference here is we're talking about, coming up with a model where that kind of input needs to be incorporated. I've had this discussion with Cory Booker about a new social contract using kind of labor lingo in English labor lingo. We need a new social contract. There's no question about it. But I think it's going to require a give and take of a political process. I mean, what works in Maryland might not work in Alabama unless we have a compromise where people can get on board that. I mean, what I see coming is this cacophony. We're going to have California do something, and we're going to have other courts and maybe administrative agencies do things. And then we're going to be back in this game of trying to figure out what this compromise is. Meanwhile, I think in the next 3 years, according to experts, I think you're going to see a major betting scandal on our college campuses. I think you're going to have lots of rebound effects on this employment issue. I think you're going to see some NIL deals go horribly wrong. And I believe that people are going to, and at the same time, 3 years from now, we have to look at this from a global perspective. Our institutions of higher learning are a crown jewel. I mean, we may be close to World War III with China, and we have to look at this and say, we can't do anything that's going to hurt our institutions of higher learning, because that is America's competitive advantage. And I just look at this in a big picture, and I'm hopeful that our legislative systems can work to come up with a model in college sports that doesn't turn it into the NFL and NBA, but takes into account greater equities for football and basketball players and other sports, but doesn't lose the good that college sports has done for hundreds of thousands of other kids. That's the goal. And I think that, you know, I worry that we're heading down this hodgepodge piecemeal approach, and it's going to be very bad for college sports and very bad for higher education.
Well, there's an optimistic point of view.
No, I think
you make a great point. I just had to lighten the mood a little.
To add to Tom's optimism.
Go ahead, Andy.
To add to Tom's optimism, I think the cacophony is already here, and the major scandal in NIL has already happened. It happened. Was it Rashad? Was that his name?
The Miami football player? Yeah.
Miami offered him $13.8 million. The collective offered him $13.8 million to go to Miami. And then they announced that they didn't have the money. And they probably announced that and couldn't find the money because he had a bad workout. But that's a major scandal. I don't know if it's going to get bigger than that or not.
Yeah, well, there may be more just like that. It's okay to have questions from the audience, I assume. That's before we, whoa, my goodness. I was just going to ask before we get to, I was going to give you time, guys, a couple of minutes to think about your questions. Obviously, we don't need to do that here. But Dr. Frederick, I wanted to ask you, why haven't the university presidents, or anyone can chime in, why haven't the president said, even like 15, 20 years ago, and by the way, we're not blaming you and we're not having you speak for all university presidents, but in your estimation, how is this absolute craziness, chaos, nonsense, ridiculousness, whatever we've all been describing up here, just the mess or whatever this is, whatever words we're using, as we're trying to work our way through it. How come presidents didn't just sit down and say, hey, we got to figure this out?
Yeah, so I've been a president for 10 years, so 15, 20 is a good
Okay, good.
timeline to
You're
use.
good.
But in all seriousness, I think a couple of things. One is the majority of university presidents, this is not an issue that is negatively impacting our campus. So like I tell my board, we lose $10 million on athletics, but I see it as an investment. 80% of my athletes graduate. And as I said, where our student athletes go is incredible. So for me, the system works in terms of what Howard has to do and what we are committed to with respect to our athletes. The problem is that we all belong to a much larger organization called the NCAA. And there's a lot that goes on there for which a few university presidents do have a concern. And as Andy rightly pointed out, that if you look at the major, I would say that the big five conferences, and you look at especially football and what it means in those conferences, those are the presidents, in my opinion, that are under significant pressure to balance having college football work with the revenue that it's working and managing the rest of the campus. For me, I'm more concerned about, safety, mental health, graduation rate. I mean, that's where, I'm up at night. And I think that that's one of the issues. The second one is the way the NCAA was structured. And I'm hopeful with our new president that will be different. When you look at the divisions to begin with, you have a very different conversation if you're Division I school versus a Division III school. The second thing is among the Division I's, we're not all equal in terms of the conferences. So when you look at the MEAC and SWAC, the two conferences with predominantly HBCUs, compared to the Big Five, you're having a very, very different conversation, even with revenue distribution and APR. Very interesting circumstance. And that's why I said, and even in terms of the outcome of the athletes, in terms of graduation rate, I think it's skewed. And then I would say the third thing is the way the NCAA has been run, to be just very, very frank, over that period of time that you're talking about, we lost an opportunity and a window to act. I think some of what Andy is referring to that would have avoided where we are today needed to occur some 25 years ago. I mean, I think people saw that train coming and we needed to act. Now, having said that, I think presidents are in a position now with a new NCAA president to try to take action. I think we have to redefine and rethink about what Division I looks like. I think we have to have the tough conversation as to whether or not college football needs to stay in that Big Five. The CFP needs to stay under the umbrella of the rest of the NCAA, or does it need to separate itself and run autonomously? I think we have to have that conversation. It's a controversial conversation. It's a tough conversation, but it is a conversation that we need to have. And I think the other conversation we need to have, because I hear this all the time, and I think somebody again used the example today. You know, if someone is a biology major and they happen to play music, and on the weekends they go to play in a concert and they collect money, I think that's a really skewed impression of what's taking place here. College athletes are participating in a competition that involves other institutions, etc. They are not playing on the weekend once in a time to exercise their quads or their calves. That's not what they're doing. They are participating in a competition that can affect others. So when somebody goes and plays in a concert and gets paid for that, they're not affecting the balance or imbalance of so many other universities. So I think anytime we bring this up about NIL and how it looks, I think we have to be careful that we're not providing a skewed impression. The second thing is on the collective bargaining that you mentioned. I'm very concerned that something like that will disadvantage even further certain athletes and certain institutions. I don't see HBCU student athletes benefiting from a collective bargaining agreement when they're in a conversation that may involve Big Five programs that have no concern about what my athletes are doing at Howard University. I think we have to be very careful about the collective bargaining agreement. I think Tom made a point about the states. I'm actually more concerned about a different tier of universities that could be impacted. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now, even with the transfer portal, the way it has been operating over the past 2 years, we talk about the gambling scandals. The biggest thing that is going to create a scandal in college athletics today is a lack of loyalty. The biggest thing that we've lost in terms of the student athlete has been that you could get up every year and be guaranteed that your favorite football player, basketball player is with your team. Right now, you could be one and done in terms of winning a national championship, and the next year, you're out of it. So I think that is one of the special things that I think we're taking away from what we had and what was special about watching kids who you'd never see again. Think of the number of athletes over the past 3 decades that have either won an NCAA championship for basketball in particular, men's and women, who you may never really see anywhere else, but you still tell that story some 30 years away. And I hope that they have degrees and they're doing well, but that has not been our focus in terms of making sure that they've graduated. And that's where I think we have to apply more of the pressure and more of the resources.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
So Wayne, earlier you talked about the $1.4 billion that's projected to come from the college football playoff and redistributing that outside of the participants in that. And I think I just heard you say we should have a discussion about whether or not the Power Five should separate out from the rest of the NCAA, which is a completely different model as I'm thinking about it. So which is it?
Yeah, it's both. I'm saying because we have not had the conversation, in the meantime, there are organizations like the Knight Commission making a proposal in the event that does not happen. There is some hesitation for that to happen. And I have to be honest with you, I'm not the president of a Big Five institution, so it's probably easy for me to sit here and say that. If you invited a president from a Big Five institution, that would probably be heresy. I get that. But I just have to be clear since we're having a public conversation, we want to educate people. This is an issue that we have to try to grapple and discuss once and for all. Either we're going to do it or not.
Okay.
And I think it still is an issue that just keeps churning with respect to the discussion. So I'm not contradicting myself. I'm just trying to be clear that it is still an issue. And I want to make sure that everybody's opinion is represented with respect to university presidents.
I know we have questions. I've served on boards for almost 15 years now. The presidents that we've dealt with, many of them don't have the experience in the area as Dr. Frederick does. And because they go up the ranks of provo and they just don't learn about college sports. And then college sports has become increasingly fragmented. It's almost feudal. I mean, every conference is a power in itself. And so that's because of all the antitrust litigation over the years. And so now who's really in control of college sports? It's very fragmented. And so an individual president is dealing with this crazy world, and I'm sure it's very frustrating.
And I'm glad you brought it up. So I was the manager of Howard's soccer team, and we went to the NCAA Final Four, lost to Indiana in 1988.
Remember that?
I have several friends who play professional sports, in soccer in particular. And obviously, in my role as a university president, I've also chaired the MEAC conference, sat in NCAA. And obviously now I'm the parent of a Division I athlete. So just to provide some credibility to Adam so he doesn't get frustrated with me for having some of these opinions. But so my opinion is formed over a long spectrum, a long arc of seeing a variety of different things, seeing promising athletes tear their ACL, right? My daughter is thinking about playing volleyball in college and she tore her ACL last August, right before a few visits, right? Had operation in September. We're dealing with that. So some of these issues in terms of medical care, I can see where the frustration and some of the pain points are, right? And so I just want to be clear. I think this is a very complicated issue. I do think some university presidents need to get together and have that tough conversation and probably form a group that really tackles this with legislators and people like the NLRB. To be quite honest, we need to lock ourselves in a room and have the conversation and come up with some tough solutions and tough decisions. But right now, I think we're operating in silos, trying to fix this, and that's part of the issue as well.
Why don't we take a few questions? I saw, yes, sir, your hand shot up, right? Yes, you, please.
I guess I did want to follow a little bit on the question of collective bargaining. I don't understand about collective bargaining over what. You did, in terms of eligibility, you suggested it's the amount of control. But there are many universities that lose $20 to $30 to $40 million a year. If you've lost $40 million, and UConn lost $53 million last year. If you've lost $40 million, what exactly are you bargaining over?
Racial inequities, opportunities, health and safety protections. It's not all of it. That's why I say it's not one size fits all, and compensation is different. I mean, wages is different than these other, some are, there's no cost, right? Treating people fairly and equitably, there's no financial cost to that. So, and frankly, again, as I said, there's no one size fits all. And there could be an umbrella, people may have may not understand, or maybe I'm not being clear enough, but there could be just a collective bargaining broadly. Of course, there's many different models of collective bargaining. There could be collective bargaining institution by institution to determine what issues of critical concern are there and getting the right people in the room, as Dr. Frederick said, and try to figure that out. Or it could be by conference or by division or the NCAA writ large, or whatever it is. There's many different models. If there is a national sort of model over some major issues of critical concern, and then there's some localized issues or localized agreements or bargaining that could take place. But the point is that compensation and and bargaining over terms and conditions of employment. I would argue that this is employment, at least what I've seen personally. There's not always a price tag, but it means a lot to people.
Okay, we have, let's see here. Why don't we stay on this side and go to whoever, you're pointing to him. Okay, yes, sir, go ahead. And we'll come over here
My
next.
great colleagues know me to be a big fan of college club sports. So with apologies to Nick Askew and his fellow coaches, I'd like to make the case with reference to the development of college club swimming. It began spontaneously at a few colleges like Georgia State and a few others, and then eventually it became obvious that it needed a national organization. U.S. Master Swimming stepped in for good reasons because they thought that their future members would come from the college club swimming ranks rather than the varsity ranks, because the latter would be so burnt out that they would not want to continue swimming as the college club swimmers were. So the college club swimmers get a discounted membership in master swimming. So there's a real incentive there, obviously, from U.S. Master to do that. But the point is that these college club swimmers are just like any other undergraduate extracurricular activity. They organize themselves. They do now have an Ivy League championship, regional championships, a national championship, but they're free. They're not under any strict control. The athletes do not have to go to any particular meet. They don't have to go to any practices they don't want to. They have free time. There's no opportunity cost in Andy's language. They can become regular undergraduate athletes and participate in full range of things. And by the way, college club sports emphasize socializing a lot more because there's more time to do that. And they can also innovate. College club
I'm sorry, is there a question?
Yeah, college club swimming has things like a relay around Manhattan Island. So the point is, I agree that there needs to be a different model. My suggestion is financially as well, college club athletes should be the model for undergraduate college athletics, okay? The Olympic sports, as Andy mentioned, should be organized on the national level, supported nationally as other countries do. And I leave it to the rest of you to figure out what to do with football and basketball, because
Okay.
I agree with Tom, it's an entirely different problem.
Well, thank you. Thank you, sir. Yes, why don't we go over here? We've got several hands up. This gentleman here near the wall back, if you raise your, yeah, there you go. Thank you. We're going to get your steps in here. We'll go over here for a few. We'll get back over here.
Thank you. Burton Corners, Assistant Athletic Director for Student Athlete Development, Morgan State University. Education seems to be at the center of all of this discussion. One thing I'd like to get your review on is when we talk about NIL, my concern is with a lot of the states now allowing high school NIL deals. But the thing that I keep missing, I don't hear anything about financial literacy. So before they even get to college, if I was a savvy businessman and I'm recruiting Christine, I might go to the mom and pop pizza store that you already have a high school deal with and say, hey, I'm gonna kick you some money to try and bring you to UConn or whatever the case may be. So what are your thoughts on the high school NIL deals?
Andy, Tom, anyone? Does sound like an issue that is obviously starting and it could get huge in fact, I think we can easily see how that would just explode in the next few years. Thank you for the question. Go ahead, gentlemen. Jennifer?
I mean, obviously, the issues we're seeing in colleges, we're beginning to see in high schools. And, you know, these kids that to some point, they need help. Their agents, we hear this a lot in college where agents are coming in and saying, no, you don't want to go in the pros. We need to get you into another school because that agent can make 20% commissions on that deal. When if they go to the pros, there's a standard fee, which is much smaller than that. I mean, these abuses are going to go down to the high school level. I mean, it was very interesting when you try to pass a national regulatory structure for colleges. How is that going to intersect with high school? Because it's going to parallel that as well. So I don't even know how they're sorting it out. I mean, I think the colleges are saying, look, when you come to high school, when you come to college, all those deals have to go away, and they're leaving it to the high school associations to try to regulate this. It is a problem. There's no question about it.
I think it'd be a wonderful development if financial literacy became part of the high school curriculum. We shouldn't wait until college to teach kids financial literacy, whether it's with regard to NIL or anything else.
Sure.
Great.
But no, I think you've just hit on maybe one of the next panels for the next couple of years, because this is going to trickle down to the high schools and the explosion of all this, guaranteed. You've certainly nailed it. And I know you're on the front lines. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for the panelists. Tracy Jones, Executive Director of the Pawn Lab. We talked a lot today about like this hypothetical model for the NCAA, but the NCAA has already talked and approved the new model, which was disclosed in the Transformation Committee report back in January, adopted parts in the second week of January, and the NCAA just released on Friday that they're moving towards efforts that are going to develop a more holistic student athlete experience. Dr. Fredericks, just because, again, you represent the HBCU community, you talked just a lot about the stats in regards to how HBCUs really promote and solidify the pipeline for Black professionals. My question is, if the NCAA can put together a transformation committee report in 18 months, are they working with the HBCUs to put together some more holistic programming for those revenue generating athletes, and having you as a president and conferences at the table on the forefront before they punish us like they did with APR on the back end?
Yeah, it's a good point. And the reason I'm optimistic that there's more change to come is because we have a new president. And that's the reason I'm saying, although we've agreed on a structure, I still think the implementation is important. So he's already reached out to meet with the MEA conference, which I think is extremely proactive, that he's willing to do that. I'm optimistic because I do think that he sees the inequity. I do think the Transformation Committee was able to see the inequity, especially in the graduation rates that I pointed out earlier. And I hope that some change will come. The one downside that I am concerned about is that if we do not have a system that everybody is agreeing on, even outside of NCAA, especially with things like NIL, regardless of what we do, it will still harm our athletes. I think there will be a skewed underrepresentation that will harm our athletes. So your point is well taken, but my optimism does come from, I think, the appointment of the new president and the fact that he has already been proactive about reaching out to get our input. And we did have representation on the committee, I should say. Morgan State was here. David Wilson was on that committee, as well as Adams Gaston, the president of Norfolk State, was on the Transformation Committee.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sally Roberts. I'm the CEO of Wrestle Like a Girl. We're the national advocacy organization for girls and women in the sport of wrestling. In 2004, women's wrestling became an Olympic sport. In 2019, women's wrestling attained NCAA emerging sport status. And in August of this year, we're poised to be getting NCAA championship status. Thank you. In order to make those milestones happen, we needed a minimum of 40 NCAA Division I, II, or III programs. We're at 67, but only 3 NCAA Division I, with one of those being a Power 5. The work that our organization has done, we've raised close to $7 million to get women's wrestling added at these Division I programs. And what we're being told now that NIL has passed is that they can no longer add new women's programs, even if they're not in compliance with Title IX, because it's now an arms race with the NIL. And we had one particular institution that said our athletic budget has increased by $10 million. We would love your $2 million gift, but it would have to go towards our existing programs. What in your eyes do you think, how would you make a suggestion, or what are your thoughts on moving forward in the balance of NIL and Title IX, especially as it pertains to institutions that are not compliant in Title IX, but there's seems to be little to no enforcement mechanism, even if you have someone knocking on the door with money. Speaking of Dr. Wayne Frederick, we do want to have a conversation with you too, sir. Hey, buddy.
Oh, Thank you, Sally. Good to see you. I didn't, yeah.
Yeah, but being a university president, I'm happy to jump in here. You know, like I said, I mentioned, you know, Harvard. I think if you look at all schools in America, Harvard has one of the largest number of athletic programs, and it's one of the strongest academic institutions in the country. I think that there's some correlation there. We would love to add sports. I have a simple rule. If we add sports, it can't come out to the operating budget. So we added men's and women's golf because of a very generous gift from Steph Curry that underruled that program. And what it has added to our university has been incredible. But it was an outside donation. I have to be frank, like I told you, we lost $10 million on athletics. It's a tough thing to manage, a tough budget, and Andy has already pointed out several of the things that cause us to lose money. So adding sports is a really difficult thing. I'm supportive, but it has to be something where somebody else is paying for it and we're not taking it out to the operating budget. And I can't do that in good conscience, just to be clear, because 42% of my students are Pell Grant eligible. And I tell people every day, you know, getting every single one of them to graduation, it creates generational wealth. It transforms their families' lives. It's not just about that one student. What Howard does in terms of graduating every single student that's Pell Grant eligible is absolutely unbelievable. So we have to be really cautious about where we spend our money.
I think we had a couple questions back over here. We've got, what do we have? About, 1 minute. We could take a couple more if that, or at least one question. Was there a hand? Yeah, Steve, if you want to, why don't we try to do lightning round with you? I'm sorry, was there a hand over here I missed?
One in the middle.
Right here, yes. Just want to make sure before we had him leave. There you go. Oh, I didn't even know we had 2 microphones. There you go. And by the way, thank you, Sally, because this clearly is an issue of NIL then either indirectly or directly depriving women of opportunities. Andy, you mentioned that early in the panel. That was not something I thought of, and that is a story for all of us journalists in this room and everyone else in the room as well. Please go ahead.
My name is Katie Lever, and I'm a Dr. Katie Lever. I'm still not used to that. I defended my dissertation on Wednesday, so it's still very new. Thank you. And I'm a full beneficiary of Title IX. I was a Division I athlete in college, reaped a lot of the benefits that we talked about when it comes to organized sports. And as somebody who writes a lot about college sports policy and athlete rights, something that's really frustrating to me is whenever I talk about like name, image, and likeness or collective bargaining, the issue that comes up is what about Title IX? And when we look at the landscape of Title IX in the United States, we see, huge inequities there. We're talking like 18% of recruiting dollars are given to women, 33% of operating budgets, 45% of scholarship dollars. And not only that, but the Women's Sports Foundation says that about 90% of universities in the United States are not Title IX compliant. So when I hear this argument, what about Title IX when it comes to things like collective bargaining, my follow-up question is, why should we care about Title IX being a barrier to collective bargaining when 90% of the United States sports industry doesn't care about it either? So how?
You two are definitely a team here.
Yes, Dave and I are close. So how do we manage that tension in these conversations when, people ask, well, what about Title IX? And they're not having conversations about Title IX in any of their other financial decisions with female athletes?
It's a great question. I'll dive in for just a quick second as someone who's reported on it, and of course also a beneficiary at the beginning. Most universities couldn't have cared less about Title IX for maybe 10, 15, 20 years. Donna Lopiano is one of the great, obviously, historians and experts on this topic, and fighting for those as Women's Sports Foundation, University of Texas, everything about your bio, Donna, has screamed out, working hard for this. Today is the greatest day to be a woman in sports in America until tomorrow. But it's, so I'm a glass half full person, right? So many things have happened. I mean, who would have ever thought we would see, as Andy mentioned, the 9.9 million viewers of the women's final. And it peaked at I think 12 million. And the men were like at 14 million. I mean, we're close. This is really close. That would have literally knocked everyone's socks off 5 years ago. So Caitlin Clark is going to sell out arenas around the country. She's going to be the Harlem Globetrotters coming to town. I mean, literally, and LSU maybe too, but I'm speaking of Clark because of the singular position she plays, not in the paint, but the passing and has the ball, and she's kind of alone there as we watch her as the player of the year next year. The ticket sales are going to be extraordinary. So there's so many positives, but I think the ingrained sexism is extraordinary. It exists. I bet you if we put 5 football coaches up here right now, truth serum, and said it would not leave the room, I'll bet you they'd all roll their eyes about Title IX. Even if they have daughters playing sports. It's better. It's much better than it was. And you know that, but I think it's going to take, when you're our age, I think you're going to be doing a victory dance down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Christine, I don't think an NIL bill will get through Congress unless there are enhanced Title IX protections in it. So I think
And then it has to be enforced.
that's,
Yeah.
that's right. That's true.
Yeah, needed daughters to sue. Well, women presidents, and of course, Howard University has given us a vice president. Congratulations on that. And I think, yeah, I think it's better than it was. It's still incredibly frustrating. But each day, when you get the Neanderthals, you know, the 3 guys hiding under a desk in Montana somewhere to finally, you know, who hate Title IX, you know, come on out, guys, it's over. It's so much better than it was, right? And it's about mindset. And so the fact that those 3 guys hiding under the desk in Montana, like they came out to watch LSU versus Iowa, or they would have loved to have a ticket to that game. That's a little victory right there. And I like to look at it that way because we're getting there for sure. But oh my gosh, you know, it's been a long slog, hasn't it, Donna? For sure. One more question, if there's any last thing. I know we're over time, but one last, yes, ma'am, please go ahead. And then that'll be it. And go to the reception or run screaming into the.
So I'll make this a very quick question, but it's going to be a grenade right at the table. I'm here. I know Andy's like, hello. I've heard a lot of the conversations here about all the different stakeholders. We've talked about what the ADs are going to be doing and what the presidents are doing and what the lawmakers are doing. With the exception of Jennifer's commentary about the collective bargaining and really pushing on that, I'm not hearing anything about the athletes. We watched the University of Missouri in 10 days change the landscape because those young men decided they weren't going to play. So when we're talking about, well, this is not going to happen legislatively, this is not whatever, there's a whole group of athletes whose bodies are being put on the line as free labor to make money for everyone else but them. So when we're talking about this, how do you close this out? Bringing the students and the athletes and the people doing the actual work to the table as a stakeholder in this conversation, because they're not being put up like that. There you go.
No, it's a perfect ending.
It's what I was saying. We are seeing more younger people elevating their voices and really saying, you know, this is us, these are our lives, and we want to be heard. Not only heard, but we want our issues addressed. And whether they do that themselves or whether they do that through a homegrown consortium or whether they do that through an established labor organization, the bottom line is that these players need advocates or need to advocate on their own behalf and need to engage in collective action, such as what just happened, in order to kind of turn the tide.
I think that's a perfect ending spot. I know that, if I may, one second. I want to say to this panel, I've been doing a lot of these over the years, and I got a text about halfway through this panel from someone in the room and said, wow, what a panel. And that was only halfway through. I want to thank these wonderful leaders for their honesty, for their time, and for really giving us a lot to think about. To each and every one of you, thank you. Thank you,
Christine.
thank you.